Helen of Foregates by Ethel Carnie. Chapter 12. Dr. Greaves is sorry. In the wood by the water, red leaves were falling. Teddy Tripp had asked Martin to stay on at Corplestone's farm. He had been a good help. Teddy could get away oftener. Besides, Martin had made a clear £40 in the summer for Teddy at Brungley Cattle Fair. Martin was fine on a farm, but he looked so ill that Foregates was always rumouring his death. He was going up to Mason's farm now. He was going for his wages. He stumbled against a man halfway up the hillside. "Which way to Days?" asked a weak voice. Martin told the man and followed in his footsteps. But Jim Brett travelled too fast for him. He wanted to get back to Sally, and had heard in the inn of the good luck of his old pal Day. It was like a beacon in his misery. The hatred of Day in the village, mingled with admiration of him, had scared him not at all. Day and he had dossed together. He went on. Martin followed. Those wages of his were really an excuse for getting into the farm. Helen, so he had heard, was at death's door. He was crawling up the wet hillside to be nearer her, crawling ignominiously with that cough shaking him, to be near the woman who cared nothing for him, who was bearing another man's child. He was going up to the farm to ask for his wages, as if he had not got them to the full. In the inn he had heard from Andrew, who was blind drunk, of how Helen had once tried to wed herself to him, Martin Scott. He hadn't even minded the publicity of the thing. He was going up the hillside in answer to that call from the past. A gust of coughing seized him on the crest of the hill. Whilst he struggled in its grip, a string of curses fell on his ears. It was the man who had preceded him, coming back. Hope knocked out of him again. Day had laughed in his face and shut the door, saying he didn't know him. Martin gave him a sixpence. It was one Teddy had given him, with a cautious look not to let Lizzie know. He had taken it in irony of spirit. Cursing, the tramp went down the hillside, back towards Little Moreton. Martin reached the white gate. His hand felt the familiar notch in the third paling. The dog was in its kennel. It sprang up, the heavy chain clanking at his approach. He spoke its name. It growled, menacing him. It was a bad omen, he thought. Even the dog had forgotten him. If a dog forgot, how should a woman remember and forgive everything? The lonely blackness of the night coiled itself round him, an inky cold snake. He placed his hand on the dog. The growl in its throat grew deeper, then changed into a croon. At that sound from the almost blind beast, the door opened. The old man had trailed himself to open it. It was one of his better days. "Oh, it's thee, Martin," he said. "Come in." For there were only 3 folk in the world brought that croon to the dog's throat. The sound had announced Martin. Martin entered. "Hello," said Fielding Day, sitting by the hearth. He nodded coolly. Martin nodded back and sat down. The sight of Day sitting in his old chair brought a maddening jealousy to him. "I've come for me wages," he said in his old monotonous way. Mason grinned. "Thy wages?" he said pleasantly. "Well, thou'll get 'em if thou waits long enough. Most folk do." The old man sitting at the back of the kitchen cleared his throat. Blast it! He was going to cough, going to exhibit his weakness before this strong, handsome husband of hers. He tried to stem it, but on it came, shaking him to bits. He struggled against it all the time, hating it like something human. At last he shook it off. There was absolute silence in the kitchen. Then he heard from the room next the kitchen, his old room, the room in which he had slept on that first night at the farm, the voice of the doctor. "Now, Mrs. Day?" The feet of Andrew's wife going over the floor went over his heart. Fielding Day sat, trimming his nails. Mrs. Day. The title jabbed at Martin. He heard Andrew's wife tramping about the room again. Then she came out with a cup in her hand and filled it from the kettle. "How goes it?" asked old Mason. "Terrible quiet among it, isn't she?" "Some is, and some isn't," she remarked. "Aye," answered the old man. "Terrible unnatural like, it seems to me." His hands were clutching and unclutching at the arms of the chair. "She'll know one day?" he questioned. "It's been a struggle, but I think it'll be all right," she said. The clutching at the chair ceased. "Seems queer she doesn't cry out like others," he said restlessly. Under cover of being anxious that all was well, he was longing for screams of terror and agony. "Soom's doomer nor other some," said Andrew's wife, "but most flesh and blood cries out at the finish. Some calls on their mothers, poor things, and some calls on the Lord, as has never thought on him for years." She hurried away with the cup. The three men sat in silence. The whining plea of Nero came to them, somehow conscious of something going on. Without asking leave, Martin Scott went out, and unclasping the chain, brought in the dog. Fielding Day looked across at the shadow of a man, sullen, ashen, at whose feet the dog had settled. The two pairs of eyes met. Volcanic fire smouldered in the depths of both. "Sort of free and easy like," sneered Day, "letting dog in without leave. We always keeps it on chain." The hollow man laughed. "There's things can be chained and things can't be chained," he said in his husky voice. "Shut up, you gabble," cried the old man. He was drawn between two ecstasies, the ecstasy that a storm was brewing between the two men, and that Helen might hear it in that other room, and the ecstasy of waiting for that cry which Andrew's wife said all flesh and blood gave. He was listening with an intensity that gave him a burning look. "What does ta mean by that?" asked Fielding Day of the hollow man. Martin merely smiled. "Get out of here," said the boss suddenly in a white fury. "I were here afore thee," laughed Martin. "I won't have my wife upset with hearing thee," said Fielding. They were grinning at each other now like two animals, the man who had tossed away a human soul and the man who had picked up the empty shell that had held it. "I shan't shift off this chair till I'm ready," said Martin. His hand was caressing the dog. The thing was crooning with an old delight, crooning and sniffing rapturously at him, at his dripping old coat and the thin shoes that let the water in. "Come under, Nero," commanded the boss. The dog slunk a few inches from the feet of the broken man. Passion of an old worship and fear of punishment were clashing. "Nero," Martin's husky whisper brought it back to his feet. Fielding Day crossed to the corner and took the ivy stick. "Not with my stick," said the hollow man in that monotonous voice. He had risen to his feet. The dog had risen to follow him, thinking he was departing. "Why didn't ta take the dog with thee?" jeered the boss, whilst all the time each knew that their reference was not to the dog at all. "Shut up," cried the old man. From that room, as wall corner came to his ingle-nook, he had heard a muffled cry. "'Twould follow me all same," boasted Martin Scott. Fielding grinned again. He had a fiendish look. He had reached the stick. The dog slunk away under the saddle. Fielding Day approached and tried to poke it out, but a growl, mingled with a whine of fear, was all the answer. Martin Scott stood watching him. The old look of iron control was on him. But when Day had moved the saddle and clutched the dog by its collar, he crossed the kitchen. "Touch that beast with my stick," he began. Fielding Day threw back his head and laughed. The next moment the ghost of a man had rushed at him. They closed, two jealous savages swaying together, and the table with the red globe lamp crashed over. "Hell! Hell!" laughed the old man. he trailed himself across the kitchen, and with a spurt of his old agility, inspired by the joy in his mind, he picked up the flaming lamp, and opening the door, flung it out into the wet garden. There was only the light of the fire over the chaotic scene in the kitchen as he came back, walked carefully past the wreckage and the struggling men to his chair. "Now fight if you like, you devils," he jibed at them. Like the god of hate himself, he sat back in his chair, listening to the music of those moans torn from the woman in that other room, listening to the broken panting of the man who had deserted her, and to the inarticulate curses of the man who had picked her up. He wondered if Helen had heard and recognized Martin's voice. "Let go," it was Dave's voice. Martin's thin hand was at his throat. Then they had staggered and rolled together on the floor. Martin was on top. The firelight made a bright patch of blood red beside them. The black shadows danced over them. "I'll gouge the een out," gasped Dave. Martin laughed. Dave shook himself a little away from that hand. They had forgotten the woman. Now, as dogs forgot a bone, they quarrelled about in the ancient lust of battle. Only the desire to work was there. "Went away and came back," he laughed. "Think she cares now? They'll be dead, man, dead next spring. I've kissed her, man, I've beat her, I've done as I liked. She's been mine, all mine, every cell of her body." The taunting of his rival made Martin's hands slacken. His grip left the other's throat, but he still knelt on Dave. "She's been mine," he said, looking into the other's eyes. Fielding Day was cunningly getting his leg around Martin's. From under the settle came the growl of the dog. "I don't care a hang for thy metaphysical possessions," sneered the boss. "A thing I've hold on is mine. If I—" With a subtle twist he half got from under Martin. Despite his words, there was demonic spite in his face. A swift movement, and he was on top. "Now, Scott," he said in a voice of suppressed rage, "I'm a savage, and thou's turned me into one." He was pummeling into Martin's head. The latter had his teeth gripped. No sound escaped them. "Thou'rt not worth killing," he said. "Thou'll soon be worm fodder without my help. I've Helen. She's mine, just like a share's mine. I've got the deeds. But just to teach thee for coming here and ordering dogging her out." His blows fell again. Then, when he had spent himself, he got up. Martin Scott lay still. "There's no one killed in Field?" asked the old man. He had realized that Dave must have been very angry. Why, the old fear was back. "I took care of that," answered the other. Martin got up from the floor. The dog came creeping towards him and began to lick his boots. He sat down again. "Here, let's have thee out," began Dave, crossing to the grey man. Martin's face was bleeding badly. Then the words died away. Old Mason sat with a look of ecstasy on his face. From that room stole a woman's cry of anguish, escaped from teeth bared in agony. The three men were silent. At the sound the dog walked to the door of the room, scratched and whined at what it did not understand. "Hell, if she should die," gasped the old man. Divided in motives, he had expressed what all three felt. Fielding Day's ambition limited, Mason's revenge to burn out without fuel, Martin to die in an empty world of ashes if one woman died. They heard Andrew's wife give a startled "Oh," and the doctor's "Hush" of warning. Then into the silence that had seemed an eternity rang a piercing cry, a blind appeal. "Martin!" The stranded woman had cried out to the dying man. He had sprung to his feet at the call. Fielding Day sprang before him with a look of deadly hatred. "She has just harked back," he said, "that's all." Martin leapt towards the door leading out of the farm. When he had closed it after him, to within a few inches, he said, "All thine is she." His husky laughter was shaking with joy. Fielding Day's curse followed him. The old man had risen as soon as Martin was gone. "That not in love with her?" he asked, with a gimlet-like look. Dave pushed his hands into his pockets. "If any man makes out he has claims on summat 'at's mine," he said, "I could kill him like a rat. She's my property, and for that cry of hers," he cast a murderous look towards that closed door. "Thou needn't fear," said Mason. "Thou needn't fear. She'll never leave thee for him. She'd pluck her heart out by roots first." "How do you know?" queried Dave. "Because in some things she fashions after me," said the old man. "That's why, and that's why it's so sweet a cup." He laughed that horrible silent laughter. Then they heard Andrew's wife come in. Both men turned towards her. "Is't over?" It was old Mason's voice. "Aye," said the woman. The firelight leaping up showed her moved face. She had not been a midwife long. "Dead?" asked Fielding Day. There was dull horror in his tone. She nodded her head. "Dead? Helen dead?" gasped the old man, staring at her. There was a magnitude of anguish in the cry. "No," said the woman. "The child, I mean. A little lad, too, stillborn." "The child," he breathed. "I thought—" He sat him down again. He had thought his life's work blown down before the roof was on it. "There's been a rumpus, hasn't there?" asked the woman curiously. "A bit of bother about some wages Martin thinks he should have," said the old man. "She heard him," said the woman. "Quick ears she have." She eyed the two men narrowly. "There's your pay," said Dave's voice. The curiosity went from her eyes. "She mun be kept quiet," she said. "I'll stay an hour, then I mun see to 'em at home. I'll be back in morning." She filled a vessel with water to wash the dead child. "It's a bonny bairn," she said. "Perfect too, but just no soul in it." Fielding Day was pacing backwards and forwards. The doctor came out. "These things will happen," he said. "It's a pity. Better luck next time." He hurried away. At the foot of the hillside a dark figure rose out of the wet grass. "How is Mrs. Day?" asked a man's voice. "And she'll come through," said the doctor. "The child was born dead. A great pity." He hurried on. Martin Scott stared back at the farm. Then he went on through the darkness. He had forgotten the dripping of the rain and Day's blows. A deeper insult than he could deal had been dealt at the boss. He was the father to a dead child, and in her agony the wife of Brungley's scourge and pride had called on the dying failure. His broken boots letting the rain through, Teddy's telling him not to let Lizzie see that sixpence, his cough, all were forgotten. He was a man. A woman cared about him.